My name is Rachel Coventry, and I am the third generation here at Curtis Orchard. I got started beekeeping actually when I was in Paraguay, South America, as part of the Peace Corps. And after I finished the Peace Corps, I came back to Curtis Orchard to join my grandfather in keeping bees. And together we have managed up to 20 hives at one time. It really varies from year to year. But now he stepped away, and I'm the sole manager of the hives. And I love sharing the background of information of the ins and outs of the bees, and I'm constantly learning because honeybees are fascinating. So I think the first thing to understand with honeybees is that there's three types of honeybees within the hive. There is the queen bee, there's the worker bees, and there's the drone bees. Now, the queen and the workers are females, and the drones are males. There are many, many, many more worker bees than there are drone bees, and there's only one queen per hive. So this dynamic is very important to maintain in order to maintain a healthy hive, because you need a queen that's actively laying, since worker bees will only live for about 30 days during the this time of year, spring to fall, because they work so hard. And so the queen will lay eggs every day. She can lay about 1,000 to 2,000 eggs per day if needed. Uh, she will lay, of course, to the open cells. And from my observations of watching her in the observation hive, it takes her around 20 seconds to lay an egg. So what she does is she walks along the cells. She'll stick her head into a cell and see that it's free, and then she'll turn around and deposit her egg in backwards. Then, while this is happening, you have the worker bees. Now, the worker bees have, as their name implies, all the work to do. So they clean the hive, they feed the babies, they feed the queen, they care for the queen, and this all goes on while the queen is laying. She'll have like a ring of attendants that are around her, feeding her, cleaning her, taking care of her, and then all the other ones are doing all the other different jobs. And I mean, I can go into lots and lots of detail. The cool thing is that each worker bee will have these different jobs at any one point, and it's based on their age, which is kind of cool. So when they first hatch out, their very first job is to clean the cell that they hatched out of. And then some of the earlier jobs are like feeding the nurse bees. They don't actually end up flying until the very end of their life. So the ones that you see out gathering nectar and pollen, they are the oldest worker bees. And at some point, they will just usually fly out and die in the field. And that will eliminate the need of another worker bee carrying a dead bee out of the hive, which is what they do, because they keep their hive very clean and orderly, and they don't want bees just piling up inside, ideally. So that's the worker bees. The worker bees are the pollinators. They're the ones that will visit the flowers, and they aren't necessarily conscious that they're pollinating, but their work involves gathering nectar and pollen from each of these flowers. And as they visit flower to flower, some of the pollen that is on them will brush off onto the other flowers, and that's how the cross-pollination happens. And you see the little pollen granules on the back hairs of their back legs. We call them pollen baskets. There's not actual baskets on their legs, but what they do is they stick it together. They stick the little pollen granules with a little bit of nectar or honey from their mouth, and then it forms that little ball of pollen on the back of their legs. So they bring that back to the hive. It's important, of course, that they have both pollen and nectar that they're collecting, because the pollen is the protein for the babies and themselves and the queen, and the nectar ends up becoming the honey, and that's their carbohydrate. So it's a perfect balance for each insect to eat. Now, the drones are the males, and they don't do any of the work that the worker bees do. They get a bad rap because it sounds like they're super lazy, but they have a very important function as well. Without them, you would not have fertilized eggs for more worker bees. And so there's maybe 40 to 60 drones per hive. And though the drones hatch out around this time, and you'll have drones all the way to the fall, but they have a very sad life, because by the end of the fall, any of those that haven't mated, any of the drones that are remaining, are then kicked out and not allowed to live through the winter because they are not worker bees and they are drained on the resources and they've served their function as far as um, mating with any of the queen bee with any queen bees. Misconception is the queen does not mate with any drones within her hive. She also is only mated once in her lifetime. She may mate with several drones, but it will only take place in her first virgin flight, which is right after she hatches. She flies out. Drones have to have those really big eyes so they can try and catch the queen because they have to catch them while they're flying. They mate in the air. Any drones that do mate with the queen perish. And the queen will then return to her hive, and hopefully she was successfully mated and have the mixed genetics. And she will then lay eggs for the rest of her life, which could be 3 to 4 years. But she will never have to leave the hive again and never have to be mated again.
Hmm.
It, that's kind of in a nutshell the basic dynamics of the hive. The bees are important for pollination for the apples because any flower that the bees visit has the potential to become an apple. Without honeybees or native bees, then you do not have a crop of really anything. I mean, think of cherries and peaches and strawberries. Those things are all insect pollinated, and that's why honeybees and other bees are so important. We love honeybees, of course, because we are able to gather their honey because they produce more honey than they need, and that's what makes the honeybee so unique. Other native bees, a lot of them are solitary bees, and they don't produce excess honey like the honeybee. The general idea is that you need 2 hives per acre. We don't necessarily maintain that much because we definitely try and keep a diverse floral source and habitat for native bees as well. The thinking being honeybees like perfect conditions for flying. They want not too much wind, they don't want rain, they want sunshine because that's how they help navigate back to their hive into the floral source, and they need the temperature about 50 or higher. They'll fly maybe a little cooler, but not much more. So if you have bloom like right now, you're not getting any pollination from honeybees. So that's why it's really nice if you can encourage your native pollinators because blue orchard mason bees and some of these other native pollinators will fly on crummier weather days like this.
When asked about growing apples, Miss Coventry replied,
You really just want the king bloom to be pollinated if at all possible because that's going to give you the biggest, largest apple. The apple tree can only support so many apples properly. It's something like 50, it requires the energy of 50 leaves to make one apple. So you can think of that ratio. You're going to get smaller apples and more apples, but that's not what we're going for. We'd rather have bigger, fewer apples, but that are bigger. Whereas cherries, you need more like 90% pollination because you want as many individual fruits to develop as possible. So it really just depends. And honeybees we also keep for pumpkin pollination. Now, obviously, pumpkins are in the ground right now, but a lot of people may not know that. Pumpkins don't get planted until mid-June, and then they would be pollinated probably mid-July.
let's talk about the health of the hive.
The way you check for foraging would be to go bee spotting, which is literally walk out in the orchard and walk around and look at the blooms that would potentially be producing nectar and pollen and look for them. The flowers aren't necessarily continually producing pollen and nectar. The most foraging happens between about 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., at least for honeybees. So those would be the optimal times to go and scout, especially when you know the temperature and the sun is out. The way you look at the health of a hive would be going out and looking in the hive, we're always, as a beekeeper, we're always looking for something we call queen right, which means we maybe don't see the queen, but we observe that there's young larvae, within, you can tell the age of the larva by the size of it. So if it's just about the size of a little pinhead, it's 1 to 3 days old. So then you had a healthy queen that's laying actively. You look for a pattern, you want a good solid pattern, and you want to see the brood at not just 1 to 3, but all the different ages. The sealed capped brood, is there nectar and honey sources in there and stuff like that. So, and the overall population. Do you see any signs of pests or diseases like hive beetles or deformed wing virus, which could indicate mites? Over the winter, the bees stay out there. Honeybees will cluster. They form a tight ball, and they maintain about 98 degrees in that cluster. So they constantly are moving their wings a little bit, and they will rotate. So you'll have some that'll be on the outside, and they'll use their energy, and then they'll kind of migrate into the middle. And the queen's at the very center. That's how they keep the queen warm and the ball warm. The queen isn't actively laying. She maybe will start laying in February or so. The bees, they don't use the restroom in the wintertime inside their hive so if it's too cold. So on nice days where it's close to 50 degrees, that's when you'll see lots of bees flying out and they're pooping. They're going to the bathroom. We call it a cleansing flight, and that's nice for them because can you imagine holding holding it for weeks and months at a time? But it's amazing how nature works that way. But that keeps their hives clean. So then they'll, of course, tight cluster again, and they'll kind of move within the hive just slowly, eating the honey. So it's actually nice when you don't have these up and down days where it's cold and warm, cold and warm. It makes it harder on the bees to know where to cluster, or maybe they'll get caught outside of a cluster and you can lose a hive that way. You do lose some of your populations during that time. Like some of the bees do die, but they can live longer than 30 days at that time because they're not literally working themselves to death.
Have you made other efforts to attract pollinators?
I like to have the whole approach is pollinators in total, not necessarily bee specific, because I think it's important to attract butterflies and hummingbirds and native pollinators and leaving the habitat for them. So yes, we have black raspberries and blueberries and strawberries and red raspberries, and I have some pollinator pocket gardens, and so there are lots of different things to forage on, and trying to have forage for them from early spring to all the way into the fall. So we've got some lilies and different things that bloom late also. Try and just have a nice diverse mix of different things. And bees will fly up to 3 miles. They're not just staying on my property.
Yeah,
They're
absolutely.
visiting all the neighbor flowers too. So 3 to 5 miles they will fly, but I think they typically stay within a 3-mile radius. So that means they're flying all the way in town in Champaign. So they've got quite a range.
For anyone craving some apple cider and honey, can you tell us what your hours are?
We open July 20th, but I know a lot of people have been coming out for honey at this time and frozen cider, and we still can certainly do that. And we can do a no contact pickup also. So the best way if you want something now is just to call us, which is 217-359-5565 and dial extension 0. We're usually here Monday through Friday.
Thank you, Mrs. Coventry. It was a pleasure to visit with you and learn about bees and pollination at Curtis Orchard.